Lewis Hamilton's qualifying record at Mercedes is ending on a bit of a whimper, but to be able to win a world championship at Ferrari, he's going to need to get on top of it. But can he? Let's find out. So Lewis Hamilton cut a bit of a dejected figure, especially at the end of sprint qualifying at Qatar. And he had this to say: I'm just slow, and it's the same every weekend. So yeah, car felt relatively decent, no issues, not really much more to say. But this is what really, really stung. Who knows? I'm definitely not fast anymore. So that's a pretty damning assessment of his own driving. And even though he did a U-turn on that the next day, the sentiment still kind of remains. And that's been a pattern for this entire season. So the question is, why is it happening and what can he do about it? The simple answers that everybody has gone to are either that he's old, he's washed, he's lost it, or that the team are sabotaging him. I don't think either of those things are necessarily true. We've done a video on age and sabotage earlier on in the year. I'll put some links to those at the end of this video. But I think the real answer is a bit harder to get to, and it does require us to really listen to what Lewis and his team have been saying throughout this season about how he gets on with this car. So he said back in the middle of the year when he was really struggling with qualifying, but actually trying to work out why it was happening, he made an assessment in and of himself. He said this: it is more on a knife edge than ever, and it doesn't like when you brake late and deep and make a V of it. You have to brake early and run off and roll the speed in, and I hate that. That's just not me. It's not my way of driving. I find that really frustrating. He's describing what he feels in his particular car, but do we know whether that is a characteristic specifically of the W15, or is it something that is more generalized towards all of the cars? Because if it's something that's just specific to the W15, then there is a chance that when he goes to Ferrari, he might be able to sort that out. But there is already a driver at Ferrari, Charles Leclerc, who has his own particular driving style. So whether or not Lewis's driving style can marry up with what Ferrari have on offer depends a little bit on whether or not his style and Charles' style, especially in the early part of next season when he doesn't have a hand in developing the car so much, whether their two styles marry up enough that they can both get pace out of the car. So to try and do that, what I want to do is look at Charles and Lewis back to back at Suzuka. Okay, so why Suzuka? Well, Suzuka was the track last season where Charles finally got the car that he wanted. He got the changes on the Ferrari that made it much more comfortable for him to drive it the way he wanted to drive it. So let's just see what they do. The first thing we're going to do is have a look at some telemetry. What we're looking at here is the first part of Sector 1, the S's, the most glorious part of Suzuka, possibly the greatest racetrack of them all. And as usual, we have our normal traces. In red, we've got Charles. In turquoise, we've got Lewis. And the top trace is the speed trace. And I want to look at that first because through the S's, through the wiggly woggly bits of 4, 5, and 6, Lewis is actually ever so slightly faster. But at the exit of turn 6 into 7, you can see that Charles gets a much, much better exit and a much, much better apex speed. And the delta, Charles got the quicker time. He started 4th on the grid to Lewis's 7th at the Grand Prix the following day. What we can see here is that Lewis's delta is actually pretty good through the S's, but then as soon as they get into the turn 6, turn 7 section leading up to the Degners, Charles is ahead. And the throttle and brake traces are really important in highlighting what happens here. Lewis is really aggressive. He wants to get in, he wants to brake late and turn in hard. And you can see that in the brake traces here, where he's braking significantly later than Charles into turn 4 and to turn 6. In fact, Charles is braking in places that Lewis isn't even braking. And if you look at the throttle traces as well, Charles is taking his foot off the accelerator earlier than Lewis, whereas Lewis is braking and decelerating much, much later into the corners. And he's doing that consistently throughout all of them, which you can see here, here, and here. What's even more interesting is where they turn in. This is the turn-in point for turn 4. And look at the red and white curbing on the inside of the corner and how close each car is. This is the point at which both Lewis and Charles are fully committed to the corner. Lewis is much closer than Charles is to the apex of the corner. He's turned in much later, and marry that up with the braking, and that explains Lewis's really dynamic, high energy style, braking late, turning late, coming off the throttle late. All of these things are there for him to try and do what we talked about the other day. Because as ever, the whole point is for the driver to brake and then use their style under braking and turning to rotate the car. And Lewis's way of doing that is to get the brakes almost to the point that they're locking up and turn the car so it pivots on the front. That asks a huge amount of the rear of the car. This is Andrew shoveling again in the middle of the year. It's more just the way that he wants to attack a corner. When you do that, then the car would snap to oversteer. You start to build tire temperature. And this is something that's been happening throughout this season. Lewis puts a huge amount of load on the rear of the car, and the car doesn't always like that snap to oversteer, where he doesn't quite have the feel of, say, Max or even Charles, as we're about to find out. In this type of car, means that the rear end slides more, it snaps into oversteer, it puts the temperatures up. And then he goes into another corner and he does the same thing again, and it puts the temperatures up again. And he does it again, and because the temperatures are up, it slides more. So the temperatures go up again, and it compounds again and again and again throughout the lap. Okay, so what is it that Charles doing? So we're going to move along the lap a little bit. We're going to go into the Degner. So as you go round the turn 7 kink up the hill, you're going to take the fast right-hander into Degner 1 and then the second into Degner 2. These are really fast, highly committed corners. You have to be accurate. You have to know what you're doing. So what you can see here, again, speed trace at the top, delta, throttle, brake. And again, you can see that Lewis into Degner 1 here doesn't brake, comes off the throttle much later than Charles does. And again, into Degner 2, where you do have to brake, Lewis is much deeper on the brakes and again comes off the throttle a bit earlier. But it's at this point, just in the middle of the corner, that's the only point at which Lewis has a better delta. You can see that the turquoise line here is below the red line. And you can see also in the speed trace that Charles gets a better mid-corner speed and is therefore able to carry that speed up the next straight. So what does that look like as they're turning into Degner 1? Well, this is the turning point here for Degner 1. Both of these guys going at it full bore on their qualifying laps. And you can see how far away each of the two of them is. So around the point where that DHL hoarding comes up, you can see that Lewis is only just starting to turn his car, whereas Charles is almost fully committed with his steering at that point. And if we move the video on a little bit to Degner 2, again, look at the entry point to Degner 2. Look at the curbing on the left-hand side, and you can see that they're roughly in the same kind of place. Lewis is just starting to turn his steering wheel, whereas Charles is fully committed. Again, you can see here, this is where Lewis finally turns into the corner. Again, super, super late. We talked the other day about how Max gets his speed, and Charles does something very similar. The idea being that he gets the turn in, the rotation done early so that he can get the car straight again, taking a little bit less out of the rear tires. It's already straight earlier than it is for Lewis. He's having to put much less steering angle, much less aggressive braking inputs in to get the car turned around much more gently, which means that he has a bit more leeway with the rear end. Yes, it's still a slightly unstable rear end, but it's not spiking those rear temperatures in the same way that Lewis's technique is. And it's allowing him to get the car straight and fire up the next straight much earlier than it is for Lewis. And you can even see that on the exits of these corners here. Now, it has to be noted at least that on this lap, in these corners, Lewis is actually quick. His technique does work, but he's starting to run out of tires already by the time he gets into sector 2. And that, unfortunately, is a problem. And he then bleeds lap time, ending up 4/10 slower than Charles at the end of this lap. And you can argue part of that is because they're in different cars, but there is a fundamental difference in the way that they get their pace. And that's what worries me about this. That the car that Lewis is going to get when he turns up at Ferrari, certainly in the first stages, is going to have a strong front end because Charles is going to need that. And so does Lewis. So that part of it is fine. But the way that they manage the rear instability, the way that they rotate the car puts different demands on the rear tires. Lewis is putting a huge amount on the rear tires that loses him performance as you get further and further into the lap. Whereas Charles is a bit more gentle. He gets that done early, taking a bit less out of his tires, but still maintaining huge pace through the corners. Is that something that Ferrari can engineer themselves out of, engineer Lewis out of? Will they have the motivation to do that if they've already got another driver that's doing what he needs to do? I really, really hope so. Because in the races, Lewis has got fantastic race pace. He's still maintaining that, even up until Las Vegas last weekend. But that's no good if you're qualifying 3 or 4 places behind your teammate. And that is where Lewis needs to do the work. If he has any motivation left, it's to do the thing that he doesn't want to do, which is to roll the car in with a little less aggression, just off that knife edge. Just give it a little bit of leeway, Lewis. And I think you'll get the answers you're looking for. Hope you liked that. As usual, if you did, please like, please subscribe, please leave us a comment. I'll read every single one and we'll reply to as many as we possibly can. And we will see you guys in the next one.